I sit alone in a dimly lit room, the years pressing heavily on my shoulders. Before me lies a faded map, its edges torn, its surface scarred with the lines of battles fought long ago. My hand lingers over the ink marks, arrows, circles, notes written in haste, reminders of choices made when time was short and lives hung in the balance. I was once called a commander, a leader of men. They saluted me with unwavering trust, believing I would guide them to victory. History may remember my uniform, my rank, the ribbons I wore upon my chest, but what it does not see, what I cannot escape, is the shadow of a single decision that condemned thousands. I am not here to polish medals or repeat the hollow speeches of the past. I am not here to be celebrated as a hero. No, I have lived long enough to know better. I am here to confess, because I am not a hero. I am the man who made a mistake, an error born of pride and certainty, and in that mistake I led men into ruin. This is my story. This is my burden. I was not born into greatness. My family carried no banners, held no titles. My father was a school teacher in a small English town, a man who believed more in books than in bayonets. My mother tended the home, gentle and reserved, teaching me patience and the value of silence. From them I inherited a quiet sense of duty, though in my youth I mistook it for ambition. As a boy, I devoured every story of war I could find, tales of noble charges and daring victories. I would sketch crude maps on the kitchen table, imagining myself the architect of triumph. To me, war was not horror. It was glory, a stage upon which ordinary men could become immortal. I did not yet understand the cost written between those pages. When the Great War came, I was still a child, too young to serve, but old enough to see its scars. I watched veterans limp through the streets, eyes, hollow uniforms, frayed medals gleaming like bitter reminders. I told myself I would be different. I would rise above the chaos and bring order where others had failed. It was that hunger for meaning, for recognition, that drew me to the military academy. There I learned discipline strategy and the intoxicating belief that I was destined to command. I thought myself ready to shape history. In truth, I was only a boy chasing shadows, unaware of how heavy those shadows would one day become. When war finally came again, I felt no hesitation. The drums of conflict echoed across Europe, and with them stirred that old hunger inside me. I told myself it was duty, that I was answering the call of my country, defending freedom against tyranny. But beneath that noble veneer lived something more dangerous: pride. I craved the chance to prove myself, to step out from the long shadow of the Great War veterans and carve my own mark upon history. My men saw a confident leader, calm in his bearing, certain in his words. They could not see the restless fire beneath the voice, whispering that this was my moment, that destiny had chosen me. I wrote letters to my wife with a soldier's resolve: do not worry, I will return. This war will not break me. To my children, I promised tales of courage, of victories won. I believed every word, because to doubt them was to admit fear. But fear was there, buried deep. Not fear of death, but fear of failure. Fear that I would falter when the world needed me to stand tall. And so I grasped that certainty like a drowning man clings to driftwood. That certainty would one day lead me to ruin. The world I stepped into was already trembling on the edge of collapse. Europe, once proud and scarred from the Great War, was sliding once more into darkness. The newspapers screamed of invasions, of treaties, broken, of nations swallowed by the march of tyranny. Each headline seemed to push us closer to an abyss we swore never to return to, and yet here it was yawning open again. In the streets of London, I remember the mixture of dread and determination. Families queued for rations, children carried gas masks to school as if they were toys, and men of every trade lined up outside recruitment offices. There was fear, yes, but there was also a strange resolve, a belief that this time the free world would not stand idle. For officers like myself, the atmosphere was intoxicating. Politicians delivered fiery speeches. The newspapers hailed the strength of our armies, and every parade, every column of troops marching through the city seemed to promise inevitable victory. We wore confidence like armor, convincing ourselves that preparation alone would shield us from the chaos of war. But I see now that such confidence was a double-edged sword. It gave us courage, but it also blinded us. We mistook conviction for certainty, resolve for wisdom. And in that blindness, men like me, the ones entrusted with command, walked willingly into mistakes that would bleed the battlefield red. I once believed that every choice I made was the right one. The academy had trained me to trust my judgment, my superiors reinforced it with promotion, and my men followed me without question. For years, that belief carried me forward, steady and unshaken. But war is merciless. It exposes arrogance, it strips away illusion. On one field, on one day, I discovered how fragile certainty can be. With a single order delivered in confidence and pride, I sealed the fate of thousands. I remember the silence after more deafening than any bombardment, the silence of lives extinguished, of a battle lost, of trust betrayed. I am not here to defend myself. I am not here to soften the truth. I am here because the weight of that mistake has never left me, because every night it returns in the faces of the men I led to ruin. This is not the story of victory. It is the confession of a commander who failed, and of the terrible cost of believing oneself infallible. The first days of war are etched into my memory with a cruel clarity. I can still hear the whistle of the train that carried us away, the clatter of boots on the platform, the smell of coal, smoke, and damp uniforms. Crowds had gathered to bid us farewell, waving flags and handkerchiefs, their voices cracking as they cheered. Yet beneath the cheering lay the tremor of fear wives, clutching their children, parents with trembling lips, knowing too well what it meant to send their sons to war. I remember seeing my wife in the throng. She stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on me. She tried to smile, but the tears betrayed her. Our children were too young to understand, their little hands waving as though I were setting off on some grand adventure. I raised my hand in return, my throat dry, my chest heavy with the weight of promises I could not yet keep. Around me, the soldiers were restless, laughing too loudly, boasting of quick victories. Some of them barely shaved their helmets, slipping awkwardly on their heads. They carried photographs of sweethearts, Lucky Charms tucked in their pockets, letters from home already creased from being read too often. They looked at me with eyes full of trust, as though my rank alone guaranteed their survival. Inside, I was torn between pride and dread. Pride that I had been chosen to lead them, dread that I might fail them. But I buried the dread beneath the uniform, beneath the still mask of command. A general cannot afford hesitation. Doubt spreads like rot. So I stood tall, saluted the cheering crowd, and convinced myself and them that we were marching toward glory. I told myself the fear in their eyes was fleeting. I told myself my wife's tears were only temporary. And yet even then, as the train pulled away and the smoke swallowed the station, I felt the faintest whisper of unease. A whisper I ignored, and one that would return to haunt me for the rest of my life. Training was relentless. Days bled into nights on muddy fields, the air thick with the bark of orders and the metallic clang of weapons. We drilled until our bodies ached, forced marches in the rain, endless repetitions of maneuvers, the constant echo of gunfire from the ranges. It was meant to harden the men, to turn frightened boys into soldiers. And in some ways it did. I watched them change. Faces once soft with youth grew hollow eyes, sharper movements more deliberate. They joked less, smoked more, and clung to routine as though it were a lifeline. At night in the barracks, I heard the quiet sobs muffled into pillows, the whispered prayers to distant gods. By morning, they stood straight again, hiding the cracks behind bravado. As their commander, it was my role to give them strength. I walked among them, offered words of confidence, spoke of honor and victory. I told them they were the tip of the spear, the chosen few who would carry the fight into enemy territory. They listened, nodded, cheered, and yet every time their eyes met mine, I felt the unspoken question: can you truly lead us through this storm? The truth was, I did not know. I had studied strategy, memorized maps, rehearsed battles in theory, but no book had prepared me for the burden of so many lives bound to my decisions. Still, I buried my doubt beneath polished speeches and steady gestures. The generals above me spoke of swift victories, of ending the war before winter. Their certainty was intoxicating, and I drank deeply of it. To question was to show weakness, to hesitate was to betray. And so I embraced their vision, convincing myself that our preparation was flawless, that courage and discipline would carry us through. In those weeks of training, I forged not just soldiers, but the illusion of inevitability. An illusion that I, more than anyone, would come to regret. In the quiet hours before departure, I found myself at a desk with paper and ink, the weight of silence pressing heavier than any battlefield I had yet faced. Writing to my wife was harder than drafting orders for 1,000 men. How could I compress love, fear, and promise into a single page? I told her what I thought she needed to hear: that I was strong, that the men believed in me, that victory was certain. I wrote of the future we would share when the war was over, of evenings by the fire, of our children running through fields unscarred by war. Do not fear, I assured her. This will be over soon, and I will return to you. The words looked so sure in ink, but even as I wrote them, I felt the tremor in my hand. To my children, I tried to sound cheerful, almost playful. I promised them stories when I came home, tales of bravery and adventure, as though this war were nothing more than a long journey. I told them to study hard, to look after their mother, to wait for me by the garden gate. I imagined their little faces lighting up as the letters were read aloud. But time has a cruel way of turning ink into lies. Those letters written with pride and certainty became bitter relics. For every promise I made, there was a family I would one day write to with sorrow. For every vision of reunion, there would be an empty chair at the table. I did not know it then, but my words so full of confidence were already betraying the truth. I had given them hope, and in the end, I would take it away. The order came with the crisp certainty of official language, stamped and sealed as though history itself had already approved it. Operation Market Garden. A bold stroke, they called it. A chance to end the war before Christmas, to drive deep into the heart of the enemy and break their will once and for all. To me, it was more than a mission. It was the moment I had long awaited, the stage upon which I would prove myself. In the briefing rooms, the air was thick with smoke and ambition. Maps were unfurled across oak tables, pens and strings, crisscrossing rivers and bridges like veins in the living body. Senior officers spoke with fervor, voices rising in confidence, dismissing concerns as mere caution. Intelligence warned of heavy resistance of armored divisions lurking in the shadows, but we convinced ourselves they were exaggerations. Speed, we believed, would overcome all. I remember leaning over the map, my finger tracing the line of advance, a narrow corridor that cut through Holland, relying on a chain of bridges to hold. If we move fast enough, I said, they won't have time to react. Heads nodded, notes were taken, the plan was sealed. No one asked what would happen if the enemy reacted faster than we anticipated. Inside me, a quiet voice whispered hesitation. It told me the plan was too fragile, too daring, too dependent on fortune. But pride drowned it out. I wanted to be the one remembered for ending the war, for sparing Europe another winter of blood. I saw myself not just as a soldier, but as history's instrument. And so I silenced my doubts, issued the orders, and set the machine in motion. Looking back, I see now what I refused to see then, that every arrow I drew on that map was a lifeline, every bridge, a gamble, every promise of victory, a wager paid in blood. It was not strategy that guided me that day. It was pride, cold, blinding pride. The morning of our advance is etched in my memory, like a photograph stained with smoke. Convoys rumbled down narrow roads, engines growling, steel tracks grinding against cobblestones. Overhead, the drone of aircraft filled the sky, their shadows sweeping across the fields below. The men sang loudly, voices cracking, trying to disguise the fear that clung to them like a second uniform. As we crossed into Holland, the villagers poured into the streets, their faces alight with hope. They offered flowers, bread, even bottles of wine. Children ran alongside our vehicles, waving and shouting words of welcome we barely understood. For a moment it felt as though history itself was cheering us forward, as though nothing could stand in our way. I let their joy feed my certainty. I remember one soldier, barely more than a boy, tugging at my sleeve. His eyes shone with naive confidence. "Sir," he asked, "do you think we'll be home by Christmas?" I smiled, patted his shoulder, and said yes. "We will be." He grinned, reassured, and hurried back to his unit. I still see his face sometimes in the quiet hours of the night. He never made it home. The first cracks appeared almost immediately. Bridges that were meant to be ours remained stubbornly in enemy hands. Resistance was fiercer than the reports had promised. The weather turned against us, grounding aircraft, bogging vehicles in mud. I saw it all, the signs, the warnings, but in my pride, I pressed on. We were too deep now, too committed to turn back without admitting failure. I should have paused. I should have reconsidered. But instead, I chose speed over caution, certainty over doubt. That choice would prove fatal. As evening fell, I stood at the head of the column, the cheers of the villagers still echoing faintly behind us, and the thunder of enemy fire growing louder ahead. I told myself we were still on the path to victory. In truth, we were already marching into the jaws of disaster. The morning of the battle rose, not with triumph, but with dread. A thick mist clung to the fields, muffling the horizon, turning friend and foe alike into shadows. The ground shook beneath the thunder of artillery, each shell tearing open the earth, as though the world itself were breaking apart. I stood among my men, the map folded uselessly in my hand, listening to the chorus of war rifles, cracking mortars, shrieking the steady drum of machine guns, stitching the air with death. From the sky, parachutes bloomed like ghostly flowers, only to be ripped apart by flak. Some men never touched the ground alive, their bodies tangled in silk that became their shroud. Those who landed stumbled through ditches and hedgerows, mud, swallowing their boots, eyes wide with terror and resolve. Tanks lurched forward, their tracks grinding over stones, engines roaring against the cacophony. I told myself this chaos was merely the storm before the breakthrough, that if we pushed hard enough, the enemy would shatter. But even then, I sensed the fragility of our plan. The narrow corridor we relied upon was already strangled with smoke and fire. Supplies lagged far behind, communication lines broke under bombardment, and reports from the front spoke of resistance fiercer than anything we had been promised. I watched young soldiers sprint across open fields only to be cut down before reaching cover. I saw medics dragging the wounded by their collars, blood streaking across the mud. The air reeked of gunpowder oil and something worse, the sickly sweet stench of burning flesh. Each explosion etched itself into my memory like scars I could never erase. And yet I gave the order to advance. My voice calm and commanding carried over the din, masking the tremor in my chest. The men obeyed because that is what soldiers do. They did not know that behind my mask of certainty I was clinging to hope like a drowning man to driftwood. That morning, the battle no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the storm, to the relentless machinery of war. I was no longer leading. I was merely swept along, an unwilling passenger in the chaos I had unleashed. The reports came in swiftly carried by mud-splattered messengers and crackling radios that faded in and out through the static. Enemy armor had been sighted near Arnhem Panzer divisions, the very threat our intelligence had dismissed as improbable. Bridges ahead were either heavily defended or already destroyed. Units were being delayed, pinned down, cut to pieces. My staff gathered around the map, their faces pale under the glow of lantern light. One of my colonels leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. "Sir, if we press on, we risk the entire corps being trapped. We should consider consolidating, reinforcing before moving further." His eyes searched mine, pleading for caution. I should have listened. Every instinct told me the warning was sound. The corridor we depended upon was too narrow, our supply lines already strained. But pride speaks louder than prudence. I feared that hesitation would look like weakness, that retreat would shatter the illusion of inevitability I had promised. So I silenced him with a single sentence: "If we delay, we lose everything." Around the table, heads nodded reluctantly. Orders were drafted, runners dispatched. We would strike forward hard, fast, without pause. It was the gamble of a man who mistook stubbornness for courage. As the night deepened, I walked alone along the rows of resting soldiers. Some polished their rifles, others smoked in silence, their faces lit briefly by the ember's glow. They looked up at me with trust as if my presence itself meant safety. I felt their faith like a blade against my chest. I wanted to tell them the truth that I was uncertain, that fear gnawed at me, but the mask of command would not allow it. Instead, I nodded, offered a few words of encouragement, and moved on. By dawn, the decision was in motion. Columns surged forward, engines growling, boots splashing through waterlogged ground. I stood at the head, projecting confidence I no longer felt. The fog began to lift, revealing the silhouettes of enemy armor waiting in the distance. My stomach turned, but I forced the words from my mouth: "Advance." Even as I gave the order, I knew it was folly. I could almost hear the whisper of that colonel's warning echoing in the back of my mind. But I drowned it out with pride. I wanted victory. I wanted history to remember me as the man who dared, not the one who hesitated. And so with one command, I cast the die. Thousands of men marched into the fire, trusting me, believing I held the wisdom of survival. In truth, I had nothing but arrogance. That was the moment, the precise instant, when my pride became their death sentence. The attack began with thunder, but it ended in silence, the kind of silence that follows only after too much screaming. We surged forward into the narrow corridor, our columns stretched thin, pressed against the banks of the river, and the ruins of villages already scorched by artillery. At first, I clung to the illusion that speed would carry us through. Then the first shells landed. They came like hammers from the sky, smashing into tanks, flipping men into the air as if they were rag dolls. The earth trembled with each detonation, mud and blood mixing until the ground itself seemed alive with suffering. I watched one of our armored vehicles explode, its turret spiraling upward in a grotesque arc before crashing down among the infantry. The men scattered, screaming, some aflame, some already lifeless. Still, I ordered them forward. Pride is death. The bridges that were supposed to be ours became death traps. Machine guns raked the crossings, cutting men down before they reached halfway. Engineers tried to lay makeshift spans under fire, their bodies collapsing into the river as bullets tore through them. I remember the water turning dark, choked with the weight of uniforms and helmets, current dragging away both the living and the dead. I saw a company pinned against the ruins of a church, its spire-shattered bells silenced. They held their ground until artillery reduced the walls to rubble, burying them alive. I can still hear the muffled cries beneath the stone, cut short one by one. Among the fallen was the young soldier who had once asked me if he would be home by Christmas. I spotted his body near the wreck of a half-track, his helmet lying beside him, eyes staring upward as if still searching for my promise. My chest clenched, but I forced myself to look away. Commanders are not supposed to grieve in the moment. We are supposed to lead. Yet inside, I felt something breaking. Reports flooded in casualties, mounting units, cut off ammunition, running dry. I gave orders mechanically, voice steady, though my hands trembled. Every command was another wound, another weight upon my soul. I watched men throw themselves into hopeless charges because I had told them to. Each death was a mirror held to my arrogance. By evening, the battlefield was a graveyard. Vehicles burned like funeral pyres, their black smoke blotting out the Sunday. Horses screamed where they lay trapped in harness. Men crawled through the mud with missing limbs, calling for mothers who would never hear them. The air was thick with the stench of cordite and death, and I could no longer tell where the ground ended and the bodies began. And still, I told myself we could not stop. To stop was to admit failure, and I feared that more than anything. So I pushed them deeper into the jaws of a beast already devouring us. Looking back, I know the truth. The battle was lost. The moment I refused to listen, the moment I let pride command in place of reason. From then on, every bullet that struck, every man who fell was on me. That day, the battlefield did not just consume soldiers. It consumed me as well. Night fell, but the battle did not end. The flashes of artillery lit the horizon like distant lightning, each detonation shaking the earth beneath our boots. I sat hunched over a map inside a ruined farmhouse, the table trembling with every blast. Yet the lines and arrows before me no longer looked like strategy. They looked like wounds carved into a body, bleeding out with each report of the dead. Messengers came and went, their uniforms stained with smoke and blood. We're pinned down by armor on the left flank. The bridge at Nijmegen is holding but barely. Casualties are heavy. Each voice carried not just information but accusation. Every word was another stone added to the weight already crushing me. For the first time, I felt the fear not of the enemy, but of myself. Fear that I had become the architect of ruin, that I was no longer leading these men, but sacrificing them to preserve my pride. The mask of command demanded that I remain steady, that my voice never waver, but inside, I was unraveling. My aides urged me to pull back, to consolidate, to save what remained. One even whispered the truth. I refused to admit, "Sir, if we continue, we're sending them to their deaths." I stared at him, wanting to agree, but the words stuck in my throat. How could I face the high command and confess that my bold gamble had collapsed into disaster? How could I look my men in the eyes and say the courage they had shown was for nothing? So, I lied. I told them the breakthrough was close, that one final push would turn the tide. They saluted, believing me, and returned to their units with renewed determination. Watching them go, I felt like Judas sending disciples into the night. The moral weight was unbearable. I began to question everything. Was my duty to obey the plan, to maintain the illusion of victory, or was it to save the lives of those who had entrusted me with theirs? The academy had taught me tactics, logistics, doctrine, but it had not taught me how to look into the eyes of dying men and explain why I had chosen pride over mercy. Every scream on the battlefield seemed to echo inside me. Every flare that lit the night sky illuminated not just the chaos outside, but the conflict within. I was torn between the soldier's code of obedience and the human instinct to stop the slaughter. And in that torment, I realized the bitter truth: victory no longer mattered. What mattered was survival, yet I had already led too many beyond the point of return. My decisions had become a noose around their necks, and I could not untie it. That night, staring at the broken map, I knew I had lost more than a battle. I had lost my honor. Dawn broke with a pale, sickly light, the mist still clinging to the fields as though it wished to conceal the carnage. I was moving forward to inspect the shattered line when the world suddenly erupted. A shell burst close by, the force hurling me to the ground. My ears rang with a piercing whine, my vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I had been torn apart. When the haze cleared, I realized I was alive, but only just. Blood trickled from my scalp, soaking into the collar of my uniform. My hands shook as I tried to rise, and that was when I saw him. Major Collins, my most trusted aide, sprawled a few feet away. He had thrown himself toward me in that final instant, shielding me from the full blast. His body was broken, his eyes already glazing over, yet he managed a faint smile before the light left him. That image has never left me. He died so that I might live, and for what? So that I could continue issuing orders that buried more men. His sacrifice cut deeper than the shrapnel. It was the moment when the mask of command cracked beyond repair. As stretcher bearers dragged me to cover, I stared at the battlefield with new eyes. The smoke no longer looked like the fog of war. It looked like judgment rising against me. The cries of the wounded pierced me more sharply than the ringing in my ears. I had spent so long believing I was shaping history, yet all I had shaped was a mass grave. In that instant, the illusion of invincibility shattered. I was not the daring general destined to end the war. I was a man fallible, prideful, guilty. A man whose decisions had led others to their deaths while I survived through chance and the loyalty of those who believed in me. They carried me back behind the lines, but my wound was not the one bleeding from my temple. It was the wound inside the knowledge that I could never undo what I had done. That day I lost more than men, more than ground. I lost myself. The battle continued to rage, but within me something had already ended. When the guns finally fell silent, the battlefield lay in ruin. Smoke drifted low across the fields, carrying with it the acrid stench of oil, cordite, and death. The earth was torn open, pocked with craters, littered with shattered helmets, twisted rifles, and the broken bodies of men who only days before had marched with hope in their eyes. The silence was worse than the noise it pressed against my ears, suffocating as if the world itself mourned what had been lost. I walked among the wreckage with leaden steps. Tanks stood frozen in grotesque poses, their hulls blackened, their crews charred within. Horses lay stiff beside splintered wagons. The river once clear now flowed sluggish and dark choked with wreckage and corpses. Every direction I turned the landscape was a grave. In the command post, the casualty reports began to pile up. Sheets of paper covered the desk, each line a name, each name a life extinguished. The figures blurred before my eyes, 200 here, 500 there, whole battalions reduced to a handful of survivors. I signed the reports with a hand that trembled so violently the ink ran in jagged lines. My staff spoke in hushed tones, but I heard nothing except the numbers echoing inside me. But they were not numbers. They were men, the same men who had looked at me for guidance, who had trusted my promises of victory, who had followed me into the storm. And now they were gone because I had told them to go. I pressed my hands to my face, the smell of smoke and blood still clinging to my skin. In that moment, the weight of command felt unbearable. The maps, the orders, the plans, they all seemed meaningless, now nothing more than paper disguises for pride. What remained was death undeniable and absolute. That was the true aftermath of my decision. Not just the loss of ground, not just the failure of an operation, but the faces that would never return home, the empty places at tables across 1,000 homes. And no report, no speech, no medal could ever justify it. In the days that followed, the collapse of my reputation was as swift as the collapse of our lines. Within the ranks, I felt it first. The salutes were still sharp, the uniform still pressed, but the eyes told another story. Where, once there had been trust now, there was doubt. My officers carried out my orders with the same precision, but their silence grew heavier, their questions fewer. It was the silence of men who no longer believed. Some of them avoided my gaze altogether. Others looked at me too long as if searching for the man they had once followed with conviction. I could not meet their eyes without seeing the ghost of the soldiers we had lost. Among the higher command, the judgment was more restrained but no less damning. Meetings were colder now, words clipped, hands tapping on tables, while reports of failure were read aloud. My name, once spoken with respect, now carried the weight of disappointment. No accusation was voiced outright, none needed to be. The failure was plain enough, and I was its architect. The press, too, began to whisper. Casualties were reported in the papers, photographs of ruined towns appeared on front pages, and though my name was not printed, it lingered between the lines. Families at home asked why their sons had died for ground that could not be held. I had no answer for them. I had not been stripped of my rank, not formally. But inside, I knew I had already been stripped of something far greater. Authority rests not on medals or titles, but on belief, and I had lost the belief of my men and of myself. It was not their condemnation that cut the deepest. It was the quiet knowledge that I deserved it. In the weeks that followed, I lived in the shadow of a question I could not escape. Should I continue to lead or should I step aside? Each morning, as I dressed in the same uniform that now felt like a disguise, the weight of that decision pressed harder upon me. To remain in command meant sending more men into battle, carrying out operations planned by others, knowing full well that my judgment was no longer trusted. Yet to resign to lay down my rank felt like cowardice. How could I abandon them, the survivors who still looked to me, however reluctantly? How could I return home and face the families of the fallen, with nothing but the admission that I had walked away? At night, I lay awake in the dim glow of the lantern, the reports of casualties stacked at my bedside like gravestones. Sometimes I reached for pen and paper, compelled to write letters of apology to the mothers and fathers who had lost their sons. I began several words halting and clumsy. Your boy fought bravely. I am sorry. But each attempt ended with the same silence. What could I say that would bring comfort? What words could erase the truth that I had sent them to their deaths? None. So I tore the pages to pieces and burned them in the stove. There were moments when I envied the men who had fallen. They no longer carried the burden of choice. They no longer had to wake to the sound of their comrades' cries. I, however, remained condemned to wrestle with the question of duty versus conscience. In the end, I chose neither absolution nor escape. I stayed. I told myself it was responsibility that I owed it to the living to bear the weight of the dead. But the truth is simpler and darker. I lacked the courage to admit defeat either to my superiors or to myself. So I continued to command, not with conviction, but with the hollow persistence of a man who knows he has already failed. History does not pause for regret. While I wrestled with my conscience, the consequences of my decisions spread far beyond the battlefield. Operation Market Garden had promised a swift end to the war, a triumphant push into the heart of Germany. Instead, it had collapsed into failure. Because of that failure, the war dragged on. The corridor we sought to carve through Holland never opened. The Rhine remained uncrossed. What was meant to be liberation became instead another winter of suffering. Dutch towns that had welcomed us with flowers were left to endure hunger, occupation, and reprisals. I can still picture the faces of those villagers, their joy turning to confusion as we pulled back, leaving them exposed to the enemy's wrath. For the Allies, the cost was not only measured in lives, but in trust. Confidence in a quick victory dissolved. The newspapers no longer spoke of being home by Christmas. Instead, they prepared families for a war that would grind on into the new year. My name was never printed, but in every headline of delay and loss, I felt the shadow of my mistake. Among the high command, the disappointment was clear. Meetings grew sharper, temper shorter. Every strategic debate seemed to circle back to the failure of my operation. We cannot afford another Arnhem, they said. I sat in silence, the unspoken subject of every warning. In the political halls, far from the front, the ripples spread wider still. Leaders who had staked their reputations on a swift victory now faced questions, criticism, doubt. And though no one said it to my face, I knew that my decision had not only cost lives, but shaken faith in the entire campaign. Even now, years later, I wonder, had I paused, had I heeded the warnings, might the war have ended sooner? Might thousands of soldiers and thousands of civilians have been spared the cruelty of another winter? These questions have no answers. History offers no mercy, only consequences. And so I became not the general who ended the war, but the one who prolonged it. That is my legacy in the record of nations, and it is a stain I cannot wash away. In the aftermath, something within me shifted. I had entered the war, convinced that glory was within reach, that victory would cleanse the world of darkness and etch my name in history. But standing amid the ruins of Arnhem, I felt no glory, only the hollow echo of promises broken. I no longer dreamed of banners waving or medals pinned to my chest. Instead, I thought only of the faces of the men who still marched beside me. Their eyes had changed older now, dulled by grief and fatigue. They no longer followed me out of faith and triumph. They followed because there was nothing else to do. And I, once so certain of destiny, now prayed only to preserve what remained of them. At night, I found myself whispering bargains into the darkness. Let me bring these men home, and I will ask for nothing more. I no longer sought to be remembered as the architect of victory. I sought only to avoid being remembered as the butcher of my own army. It was a strange kind of liberation, twisted though it was. Pride had driven me into the abyss, but humility became the rope that held me from sinking further. I accepted at last that I was not infallible, not chosen, not a savior. I was merely human, and humans err sometimes so gravely that the consequences cannot be undone. From that moment, my purpose changed. I resolved to fight not for victory's shine, but for survival's quiet mercy, to save as many lives as could still be saved, to carry the burden of those I had already lost, and never again to let pride guide my hand. It was too late to undo the past, but it was not too late to change the man I had become. When the war finally ended, I returned not as a hero, but as a shadow. There were no parades waiting for me, no triumphant marches through cheering crowds. I stepped off the train into a station that seemed smaller than I remembered, quieter too. The banners and brass bands that had sent us away years earlier were gone. In their place were widows and black children holding photographs and the silence of a nation counting its dead. I walked through my hometown as though it were unfamiliar. The streets were the same, the church bells still tolled, but everything felt changed. Faces I once knew looked older, wearier. Some looked at me with gratitude, others with questions I could not answer. Behind every handshake and nod, I sensed the weight of unspoken words. Why them and not my son? Why do you stand here when they do not? At home, my family greeted me with tears and trembling embraces. My wife's hair had turned gray, my children no longer children. They tried to smile, tried to bridge the years lost, but in their eyes I saw the gulf between us. I had returned in body, but not in spirit. The war was over. Yet, for me, the true battle, the one inside, had only begun. The scars I carried home were not all visible. The wound on my scalp healed into a thin white line, a reminder that shrapnel had missed its mark by inches. Some nights the pain still flared, a dull throb that pulsed with the memory of the battlefield. My gait was slower, my hands less steady, but those injuries were the least of my burdens. The true wounds lay within. Sleep became a stranger. Each time I closed my eyes, the war returned, the scream of shells, the rattle of gunfire, the faces of men falling into mud darkened with their blood. I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the echo of their voices lingering in my ears. My wife would place her hand on mine, whispering reassurance, but I could not be calmed. How could she soothe nightmares born not from imagination, but from memory? Worse than the dreams was the guilt. I carried it into every waking moment. The sound of church bells reminded me of the bells silenced in a shattered village. The laughter of children made me think of the sons who never came home. Even the sight of a uniform in the street filled me with shame, for I knew that mine had once commanded men into ruin. I survived. But survival did not feel like a gift. It felt like a sentence to live on when so many better men did not. I have often been called a general, a commander, a leader of men. But strip away the rank, the medals, the titles, and what remains is the truth. I was a man who made a mistake born not of ignorance but of pride. And in war, pride is the most merciless enemy of all. One decision delivered with confidence I did not deserve cost thousands their lives. Their faith in me became their undoing, and for that there is no redemption. No speech, no medal, no history book can cleanse that stain. I tell this story not to seek forgiveness, for I do not expect it. I tell it so that others may learn what I learned too late, that war is not glory. It is not banners or parades or the hollow promises of quick victories. It is loss, always loss, measured in faces that will never be seen again, in voices forever silenced. If there is any lesson in my failure, it is this: never believe yourself infallible. Never mistake confidence for wisdom or ambition for destiny. A commander who forgets humility endangers not only himself but all who follow him. These words are all I can offer now. They are my confession, my warning, my tribute to the men who trusted me and paid the price. If nothing else, may their memory endure when mine deserves to be forgotten. Now I sit alone, an old man with nothing but silence for company. Before me lies the same map I once traced with eager fingers, its paper yellowed, its ink fading. I follow the lines with my hand, the rivers, the bridges, the towns, each one a place where men fell because I commanded them forward. What once looked like routes to victory now look like gravestones etched in cartography. The house is quiet. Outside life goes on, children laugh in the streets, church bells ring, the world moves forward. But within these walls, time has stopped. I remain bound to those days, to the roar of artillery and the faces of the fallen. I have lived long enough to see monuments raised, to hear speeches of remembrance. My name is seldom mentioned, and perhaps that is for the best. But I know that in some quiet way my story lingers, not as a tale of triumph, but as a warning. If I have one truth to leave behind, it is this: no war has winners. There are only those who endure and those who do not. And sometimes survival is the cruelest burden of all. I lived. But the best part of me died out there on those blood-soaked fields among the men I failed.